First, let's check the mic. Yes, it's working. Everybody can hear me? Thank you so much, Jeff, for that introduction. I really appreciate it. It is so great to be here today. My goodness, 5 eagle nests on one island. It's pretty incredible. You should be all very proud of the fact that you're taking such great care of this place, that they want to come here. It makes it so much better for me. I thank you to Ding Darling Wildlife Society for inviting me here today. And I wanted to tell you about my book, Return to the Sky, which is the story of the bald eagles I was trying to save 50 years ago. It's hard to believe. Although there were other restoration programs that were happening in the Northeast in the 1980s and in the Southeast, this was the one who started it all. So you're really getting in at the very beginning. These were the first eagles to be restored, and what happened with them determined what happened with the rest of the country. So it's a very important time of history, and I felt that everybody should know about it. I can also tell you that if you read the book, you'll find out how my life was changed by this program, and it was considerably, but I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk about the 7 eaglets that made all of this happen. And they will take center stage, just like all their spectacular relatives that range throughout the Northeast and Southeast to a certain degree, but that's another story, which I'll tell you later. The 1970s were a time of magic in bird conservation. And this talk is dedicated to all of those people who made it happen. It is also a positive story, which we need to hear today in the light of other bird declines. So I hope that you can appreciate the positiveness of all of it. As some of you might know, in December 2024, President Biden signed a bill designating the bald eagle our national bird. Now, many of us, including me, thought he was already our national bird, but a dedicated supporter of the National Eagle Center in Wabasha, Minnesota, Preston Cook, discovered that the government had never officially named it as such. So he was able to convince both houses of Congress, which says a lot these days, to pass legislation which made it to President Biden's desk before he was to leave office. And we can now accurately refer to the eagle as the nation's bird, and we have Preston Cook to thank for this effort. Sorry, the wind is taking a toll here. The saga of the bald eagle was inextricably tied to that of the peregrine falcon. Without its smaller and faster friend to set the pace, the fate of the Eagle Project might not have been so auspicious. And it was also the people who were able to save the peregrine who were largely responsible for saving the bald eagle 3 years later. It all began in Ithaca, New York, on the shores of Cayuga Lake at Cornell University. Now, Cornell, as many of you know, is the home of the lab of ornithology, and that's where this project began. There were many people that were dedicated to birds, particularly to raptors at Cornell during the 1970s, and those people banded together and were able to actually make it happen. So it is very important to understand that all of this originated on the southern shores of the Cayuga Lake. However, it all began really in 1962, when a marine biologist named Rachel Carson wrote a book called Silent Spring, where she sounded the bell about the lethal effects of the pesticide DDT. Now, Carson was a woman, and during those days, people didn't really listen much to women scientists, so a lot of her warnings were ignored. And, but as a result of this, she did write the book, and the book was eventually became something that people really did start paying attention to. Unfortunately, not until after she died. So she basically told us that what was happening was that DDT, which was important during World War II for getting rid of malaria, was actually also getting into the aquatic organisms and that were being consumed by birds. So by doing this, what was happening was that the birds were dying of the DDT because it was affecting their eggshells, which became very thin, and they were cracking during incubation. And these were affecting the birds that were at the top of the food chain, the ospreys, the pelicans, and the bald eagle who eat fish, but also the peregrine falcon who eats other organisms, and they were in turn being transferred to to affect the eggshells of the peregrines. The process by which all of this happens, the long name, is called biomagnification, and it means that the pesticide was consumed by species at each trophic level, and it just kept rising up the food chain until its final and top destination, which were the predators. Sadly, Grace Carson died of cancer at the age of 56, only 2 years after her book was published. But her findings luckily had been corroborated by the U.S. Geological Survey's Patuxent Wildlife Research Center in Maryland. The bird world was shocked by the truth that explained why their beloved species were all disappearing. And Carson's cause was taken up by a group of people with personal interest in the raptors affected by DDT, particularly the peregrine. In 1965, led by a falconer named Joe Hickey, a professor at the University of Wisconsin, a conference was held in Madison to discuss the problem. At that meeting, the Raptor Research Foundation was born. We need to back up. The 1970s became the Age of Enlightenment, as the federal government took up the cause of environmental degradation. Under Richard Nixon, whose administration, unbeknownst to many, had a strong commitment to the environment, legislation began to be passed to curb our decline. In 1970, Joe Hickey organized a meeting in Madison, Wisconsin, this time to call for the ban of DDT. In December of that year, the EPA was established to be the watchdog for clean air and water. Although DDT wasn't officially banned until 1972, the race was on to save the birds. Preparing the stage further to restore the species like the peregrine and the eagle was the passage of the Endangered Species Act in 1973, protecting not only the species, but also its habitat. Let me introduce the fathers of falconry. 3 men were most instrumental in addressing the plight of peregrines. Tom Cade was a falconer and ornithology professor at Syracuse University before he came to Cornell. Heinz Neng was mastering the art of captive breeding of falcons at SUNY New Paltz in New York. And of course, it was Joe Hickey. Although the falconry world was close-knit and everyone helped each other as they tried to save the peregrine, it was Tom Cade who established the peregrine fund that would bring it back. He moved from Syracuse to Cornell with the stipulation that he could house a captive breeding facility, subspecies, other regions, to be able to replace the peregrine, because there were no peregrines left in the Northeast. He created a facility known to the Cornell community as the Hawk Barn, right down the road from the Lab of Ornithology. The barn was divided into flight cages with nesting ledges to resemble the peregrine's natural habitat. Here the art of artificial insemination was mastered, although excited male peregrines sometimes forced their handlers to wear some self-defense equipment like this modified helmet with a lip around it in order to be able to catch the semen while protecting their heads. They are not to be trifled with. The peregrine program used hacking, a training technique borrowed from falconry, whereby young birds are raised and released without parents. Sometimes these young falcons can be bred in captivity and taken from the nest at a young age. In the latter case, the birds have imprinted or identified with their parents before their release, so they will mature and live as members of their species. The peregrine falcon program placed young falcons into hacking boxes where they were fed and protected by human attendants who stayed out of sight as much as possible until the birds were ready to fly and catch their own food. The hack boxes were placed in areas that most closely replicated peregrine's habitat, such as cliffsides or ledges, towers, and sometimes bridges when the program actually moved into cities to avoid the enemies of the young peregrine chicks, such as great horned owls and raccoons. After its ban in 1972, DDT levels detected in fish declined precipitously. And by the mid-1970s, the bald eagle's former habitat was ready again to accept birds. Having witnessed the success of the peregrine program, New York State's Department of Environmental Conservation foresaw the year 1976 as an ideal time to bring the bald eagle back from the brink of extinction. By then, the DDT had decimated its populations in all states of the Northeast except for a few breeding pairs left in Maine. Patriotic fever was running high by then, And nobody wanted to see the bicentennial celebrated without its national bird, or at least what they thought was their national bird. Although almost gone from the sky, the eagle's image was ubiquitous, appearing on our currency, on sports team logos, of course the Philadelphia Eagles, and the neighboring Florida Gulf Coast University, both sports eagle on their helmets. And of course on our national seal, despite Ben Franklin's disdain for the eagle, which he considered a bad moral character, supposedly because of its scavenger nature. The turkey and other contenders didn't stand a chance against the grandeur of the eagle, when our forefathers had to select a symbol of freedom, majesty, and power to represent the newly independent USA. By 1976, in the lower 48 states, the eagle had been reduced to 417 pairs, a number too low to sustain the species. According to the terms of the Endangered Species Act, the federal government controlled the bald eagle, so the state had to get permission from the Department of the Interior to launch a reintroduction program. DEC's proposal to release eagles was denied due to the state agency not having any raptor biologists on their staff who could run the program. Enter Tom Cade and his young and inexperienced wannabe graduate student, me. I had arrived at Cornell to pursue my dream to work with Dr. Cade, but when he told me I needed a funded program in order to be accepted as one of his students, my dream started to plummet. By pure serendipity, I had a chance meeting with the 2 Fish and Wildlife administrators in Washington, D.C. that were running or were in charge of the defunct eagle proposal, and things took a sudden turn. They asked Tom Cade to head the program due to his expertise with reintroducing peregrines. If I would be willing to work with the eagles, Dr. Cade said, he would be willing to supervise the project, and the eagle program became a reality. A deal was made, the project began, and officially in June 1976, the groundwork began to be laid the previous fall. The first order of business was to find a suitable site in New York from which to reintroduce the birds. Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge, near Seneca Falls at the northern end of Cayuga Lake, remember Cornell's at the southern end, was selected. Montezuma met all the requirements needed for a release site. Food would be plentiful in the 10,000-acre wetland complex of marsh, rivers, and open water. The presence of a wide variety of water birds and fish guaranteed its food potential for a young bald eagle, as well as adults returning eventually to breed. Protection of the young eaglets was paramount, so the release site had to be able to be cordoned off from the public and made inaccessible. Clark's Ridge, a hilltop overlooking Shaki Pool, the largest water body in the marsh, was hidden behind a labyrinth of roads that traversed farmland around the refuge, making it impossible to locate it. Luckily, this was before the days of GPS and Google Maps. It was important that the site be near Cornell so the peregrine team could be available in case I needed them in emergencies. The drive from Ithaca to the refuge took less than an hour. Bald eagles prefer to nest in tall trees in the V formed by the strong branches, which the young use as practice perches when they're learning how to fly. The adults like to be able to see around them, so height and being on the edge of the forest is important. Montezuma had many hardwoods surrounding the wetland area. It's perfect for future nests. I'll be battling this wind for a while. Once the site was chosen, the next dilemma was finding a source for young eagles that could be transported to New York. Healthy young eagles, I should say. Because there was no sustainable population left in any of the surrounding states, it was necessary to go further afield where DDT hadn't left its mark. Alaska had plenty of bald eagles, but this much larger species, the genetic makeup of the larger subspecies was thought to be a problem, so we didn't really want to go there. Florida had some eagle nests, but again, we ran into a problem with size of the southern subspecies being too small to put back into the Northeast. So instead, the program looked to the Midwest, particularly the Great Lakes states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, where DDT hadn't been used as it had in the Northeast, and where a healthy population of bald eagles could be found. Bald eagles generally lay 3 eggs and try to rear 3 young. However, because of food supply and energy expenditure, often the third eaglet is smaller and weaker than its siblings and doesn't make it. They're either thrown from the nest or pushed aside by the siblings until they starve. Therefore, the plan was to select the third eaglet from these 3 bird nests for transport. When the climbers scaled the nest trees to select the birds at about 7 weeks of age, it was up to them to determine which birds to remove. The position of the nest tower in the refuge was critical. Not only did it have to be hidden from the public, but it had to be high enough for the young birds to survey the land around them. Near tall trees they could use as perches once they started to fly, and most of all near the water. Clark's Ridge met all these criteria. The local electric company donated and installed 4 35-foot high poles for the tower, on top of which we constructed a 7-foot platform. My peregrine team colleagues, Jim Weaver and Willard Heck, and I had to think like eagle parents and build a nest that was closely resembling the nest where they were born. The next step was to create a canvas blind next to the nest so that I could observe and feed the birds without them seeing me. The blind was barely large enough for me to sit in cross-legged, but on the side facing the nest was a big hole through which I could feed the young birds using a long barbecue fork. So they wouldn't view humans as their providers of food source, a dangerous situation for both species. At first I had to climb the platform using metal pegs like those used by electric linemen. But once the scaffolding went up, my ascent became far easier and a bit less scary. In fact, I was even able to conquer my incredible fear of heights. We wrapped aluminum predator guards around the poles to prevent raccoons from reaching the vulnerable young birds. The day finally came on June 18, 1976, when Wisconsin Fish and Wildlife climbers called to say they had 2 eaglets ready to ship to New York. Arriving at Syracuse Airport in 2 separate crates, the birds, known as W1 and W2, were retrieved by federal officials and driven to the refuge an hour away. On hand to receive the eaglets was a large contingent of state, federal, and refuge people, a few biologists from Cornell, me, Tom Cade, me, and my 2 dogs, Max and Moses. While most of the entourage stood at the base of the tower looking up, Dr. Cade tied the ropes around the crates, Jim Weaver hauled them up to the top of the tower, and Dr. Cade and I pried open the tops and released them. The eaglets had been shrieking while in the crates, with their call-like cry until they were able to jump onto their new nest as far away from their captors as possible. These weren't tame, cuddly birds who wanted to be our friends, and for that we were very grateful. They had to have a healthy fear of humans if they were going to survive. After the eaglets settled down and the crowd dispersed, I was left alone on the hillside with my 2 dogs, wondering how on earth the eagles and I were going to survive the next 3 months. The first order of business was to set up my campsite, including my tent, my camp stove, and all the paraphernalia required for the eagles. If I look a bit perplexed and panicked in the right-hand photo, it is because I was. How on earth did I get here? To observe the birds, even when I wasn't up in the blind, I had a remote video camera with a monitor in the tent. The picture was a bit fuzzy by modern standards, but at least I could see they were okay. Many of you have experienced more advanced technology, especially if you have tuned in to any of the eagle cams here in Florida, and also in Big Bear Valley, where thousands of viewers focused on the pair Jackie and Shadow, who were trying to hatch eggs after 2 years of failure. I just heard they just had their second hatching, which is exciting. Often these images are so clear you feel like you were in the nest with the birds. This was a far cry from 1976. The next order of business was to feed the young birds. The marshes were teeming with carp, but I had to catch them and stockpile them in order to be able to feed them 2 meals a day. In the first year, fish were plentiful, and I trapped them in a spillway, and then I moved them to a big sort of cage in the water where I could net them whenever I needed to. However, in the next year, we had a severe drought, and carp were decimated. I had to enlist the help and friendship of local fishermen in order to restock my supply. Eagles are opportunistic feeders, as many of you know, so although fish is a mainstay of their diet, they also eat small mammals and water birds as well as scavenge for carrion. In order to give them a balanced diet and introduce them to the delicacies of the real world, I had to find roadkill. I spent hours driving the roads around the refuge, picking up rabbits, squirrels, muskrats, woodchucks, snakes, and other tasty morsels. By the way, rabbits were the food of choice. I knew we had to be able to track the eaglets when they left the nest, so banding and equipping them with radios became the next step before they fledged. Surveillance methods, especially for eagles, were in their infancy in 1976, so everything we did was trial and error. With lots of experimenting, we eventually were able to attach a short-term radio to the eagles and to put color tags on their wings so that they could withstand weather but also be seen from a distance. Because of their dependence on flight for hunting and migration, it was really important these apparatuses not interfere with their wing movement. We had to modify things quite a bit from 1976 to 1977 when we figured out what worked and what didn't. My issue was going to be restraining the eagles, especially when I had to handle them alone. For this, I experimented with several body wraps, but what worked best in the end, believe it or not, were my blue jeans. I cut off the leg, and its tapering shape was a perfect fit for an eagle, just like a straitjacket. He couldn't move his wings, and with his talons wrapped with electrical tape and his beak unable to reach my hands, he was safe and secure, as was I. After spending my days watching and recording the eagles' behavior from the blind, I noticed a significant increase in their energy level. Increasingly more restless and energetic, they began hopping all over the platform, flapping their wings, practicing their pre-flight maneuvers, and even banging their heads on the top of the enclosure when they started to gain altitude. It was time to remove the bars and let them out before they hurt themselves. Before long, they made their first flight. Now, many people think I must have been elated to watch them fly off the tower. However, I was not. I had little time to celebrate as they spread their wings for the first time. Because like all young creatures, first steps, or in this case flights, are a bit shaky. An eagle's size works against it when first taking off, so it looks like an out-of-control helicopter looking for a landing place. And this was usually into the marsh, far below the hillside, in the middle of a thick cattail stands interspersed with small pools of water. Without wind to help with lift, the young eagles couldn't become elevated, so were stuck. If they had parents, they would have fed them on the ground and watched over them until their wings were stronger and they could finally reach a perch. But it was up to me to find them, catch them, return them to their nest on top of the tower for a second and often third try. Hauling a struggling eagle under one arm while grabbing onto the ladder with the other was never an easy task. Eventually, they grew stronger and were able to reach a perch, either on one of the trees near the nest or the dead snags in the marsh. In 1976, eaglets spent a few months exploring the refuge inside and out, learning how to catch their own food until hunting season drove them out in October. Then they left the refuge for good, leaving me to wonder if they would survive all the perils that awaited them in the outside world. Once their radio batteries died, I had no way of being able to find them, so all I could do was hope. In late winter and spring of 1977, we began to prepare for the next group of eagles. The decision to hack 4 birds had been made. The scaffolding had to be removed so a second nest platform could be built. The blind was placed between the 2 nests so that I could feed and observe both sets of birds. With the scaffolding gone, I was back to the metal pegs for climbing. Like a mountain goat, I would clamber up the platform, push aside the plywood door to my blind, trying not to make a sound that could possibly disturb the birds. In one of these photos on the left, you can see that my blue jean shorts are missing their legs, which were in use for the rescue operations from the marsh. In 1977, 2 of our eaglets were taken from 3 bird nests, one from Michigan, M1, and one from Minnesota, M2. But we also wanted to use captive bred birds for the first time. So Patuxent Wildlife Research Center offered us 2 eaglets raised by eagle parents there. There turned out to be a huge difference between the captive bred birds and the wild young. They'd been fed an unlimited diet of Patuxent. They'd become used to people. That's all right. Let it go. Had become used to people and were feistier and more precocious than the wild birds. They had no desire to be contained behind bars and went out to the perch early after arriving. Sometimes they hopped up onto the roof for a better view. The video camera had been moved to a pole next to the nest tower so it could capture both nests and record their activity back to the trailer that had by then replaced my cozy tent from the previous year. In July, a game of musical chairs was in order. All 4 eaglets were still confined in their nest when I was told I would be welcoming a new arrival. A 3rd eaglet with a broken leg had been discovered and rescued by the climbers in Michigan when they were securing our eagle M1. The injured bird, whom I called M3, was sent to the vet college at the University of Minnesota to be treated and rehabbed. He was now ready to be released and was on his way to me. Since the 2 Patuxent birds in M1, the female from Michigan, were ready to fledge, I opened the bars on the cage so that they could come and go, and I put M3 in with M2, the male from Minnesota. We will hear about M3 later, but suffice to say, he was the calmest and most endearing of all the birds I cared for. The secrecy surrounding the Eagle Project was well kept during the first year. Everyone was worried about vandalism if anybody found out that the eagles were on the ridge. And there was a little worry about me being alone in the middle of nowhere with just my 2 dogs for protection. There was also uncertainty about whether the program would succeed. And the government folks didn't want the publicity out there until they knew the eagles had at least survived long enough to leave the refuge. In 1977, however, such secrecy was abandoned, and I was besieged by media, anxious for a juicy story. Reporters would come for an interview armed with cameras, and I would find a simple snapshot used to lure readers to a front-page article on the cover of the New York Times about the eagles and their young female caretaker. My camera-shy nature was not well suited to this new role I found myself in. But some of the notoriety was very welcome. However, in the fall of 1977, I was invited to attend the New York State Fair in Syracuse to be inducted into the Iroquois Confederacy as an honorary member of the Iroquois Nation. Although I was nervous about going, it was a memory I will savor forever. I spent the day with members of the 6 nations of the Iroquois. I learned about their customs and their culture and their incredible devotion to the bald eagle. And I was lavished with handmade gifts from each group, including the sacred eagle feather. Apparently, I was the first female to have ever received this honor, which meant that the wives of the chiefs were able to be part of the event, a historic moment for them as well. After the eagles left the refuge in the fall of 1977, my tenure as the eagle caretaker was over. I never saw these eagles catch their own food, but I knew that they were doing it because they seemed to be independent and had stopped returning to the fish I left for them on the tower, a sure sign they'd found a better option for themselves. I returned to Ithaca and completed my thesis, which became the manual on hacking bald eagles. By the 1980s, 9 other states had adopted our hacking procedures and were releasing eagles. The last state to do so was Tennessee, which hacked birds until 2020, exceeding even New York's total of 198. New York continued to hack eagles in Montezuma from 1978 to 81, deciding eventually to move the project to other sites within the state to allow the breeding birds to return to their natal areas. As it turned out, eagles aren't averse to nesting near each other as long as there is an ample food supply, so we didn't need to be so worried about it. But it explains the existence today of 28 active nests within a 25-mile radius of Montezuma. As the hacking projects increased, the states had to reach further afield to find healthy eagles for transport. While New York was using Alaskan birds by then, deciding apparently that I guess it didn't matter about the size differences, other states like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Massachusetts started going to Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia and other Canadian provinces for their birds. So the cross-border cooperation between our 2 countries really was so responsible for allowing many eagles to return to the skies of the northeastern U.S. Florida had its own unique hacking program. Because the southern eagles were smaller than the northern ones, this state didn't want to bring in eagles from the northeast. While Florida had a reasonable population of eagles, it wasn't enough to be able to donate birds to other states. So instead, they developed a program removing eggs from the active nests in Florida, the healthy nests, and transporting them to a facility in Oklahoma where they were incubated and raised until they were about 7 weeks of age, and then sent back to the south to states like Mississippi, Alabama, and North Carolina to be hacked in order to rebuild their eagle populations. At that point, they had no eagles at all. So it was an interesting take on the whole hacking procedure, the way Florida dealt with it. Also, by double clutching, eagles tend to double clutch. If you take their first clutch away from them, they might lay new eggs. They actually increased the numbers of eagles in Florida by doing this program, which is pretty phenomenal. Looking at New England and New York, we can see the dramatic increase in breeding eagle pairs since 1967, when DDT was still a threat. Only Maine had breeding pairs, and just 21 at the time. By 2023, Maine still won the prize with over 800 pairs, with New York a close second with 426. In Florida, there was an increase from 1973, when you had 88 nests, to 2025, when the number reached a whopping 1,500. These nests are split between natural trees and artificial structures like cell towers, power poles, and high-rise buildings, which is very unusual for eagles. Usually they love trees, so they're much more flexible here. Most of the active nests in the state center around the central area of Three Lakes Wildlife Management Area south of Orlando and north of Lake Okeechobee. In these two maps, you can see on the left all the nests distributed throughout the state, both active and inactive. The map on the right is older, 2005, but gives a good idea of the areas in South Florida where the eagles like to nest. I understand that there are a couple of nests in Ding Darling. Is that correct, Jeff? I'm not sure. But anyway, there are definitely 5 eagle nests on this island. Circling back to Montezuma for a minute, the 7 eaglets I had raised back in 1976 and 77. My Wisconsin eaglets, W1 and W2, turned out to be siblings, taken from the same nest. Who knew? Their bond never wavered after they left the refuge, and they went on to mate and nest near Watertown, a town a couple of hours away, raising 1 eaglet in 1980. But the most exciting news was that of M3. Rehabbed eagle from Michigan. I had lost track of them along with the other eagles from that year and could only hope that he had survived. In June 2015, I received notice from the DEC of New York that his body had been recovered, the victim of a vehicle hit. He had a band on his leg that identified him as one of my 1977 eaglets. He was 38 years old, the oldest wild eagle ever known. And he had been nesting at Hemlock Lake, the last remaining eagle nest when the project was begun. Breeding for 35 years with 2 different mates, he probably raised as many as 70 young eaglets in his lifetime. I was indeed a proud mama. Today in the continental U.S., eagles are most numerous in the Midwest and along the Atlantic Flyway. Minnesota has the 2nd largest population, with Florida a close 3rd, and of course Alaska boasting about half of the total bald eagle breeding population. The timeline of the bald eagle's recovery is defined by several key pieces of legislation and moments in the U.S. history of conservation, beginning in 1940 with the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. By 2007, the eagle had recovered enough to be removed from the endangered species list, although states like Tennessee were still hacking them back to the wild for 13 more years. After 1977, I never returned to Montezuma, although I passed it on the thruway and always craned my neck searching for the tower on Clark's Ridge. I followed the news about the hacked eagles as much as I could, but once Dr. Cade moved the Peregrine Fund to Boise, Idaho, and merged it with the World Center for Birds of Prey, my source of information was gone. In 2019, Tom Cade died, and by 2020, I knew I had to tell this story. I knew this meant returning to the marshes to see the eagles again. In November 2022, my husband Larry and I were shocked when we drove into the refuge. When I had left almost 45 years before, there were no nesting eagles and little sign that the species would become the signature species of the refuge. Now we passed many images of eagles welcoming visitors. After I convinced the current refuge staff that I had been the one to start the Eagle Project, thanks to the expertise of the Cornell Peregrine Fund and Tom Cade, I was given the keys to the city, or the refuge as it were. I was shown the giant sculpture designed by Jay Seaman for the 40th anniversary of the reintroduction program that sits on the edge of the refuge adjacent to the New York Thruway. If any of you have ever driven that road, either east or west, you can't miss it. It is monumental. Accompanied by our Montezuma guides, we bushwhacked our way up to Clark's Ridge, long overgrown, but still the home of the nest tower, albeit a bit draggled all these years later. Holding the video camera, however, it was still intact. I went down memory lane with my patient listeners as they had to listen to the project, the start of the eagle recovery, and the role Cornell had played in its design. As we stood on the dike road that runs along Shockey Pool from where I had rescued so many youngsters from the cattails, adult and immature eagles were flying all around us. I celebrated their success of 7 active nests inside the refuge with 14 more in the surrounding area. Some pairs even build 2 nests, perhaps as insurance against disaster, but I like to think they are so secure and comfortable they want a winter and a summer home. Here I would like to share what was racing through my mind at this time by reading a short passage from the book about this experience. Several eagles fly over my head towards a group of red maples hugging the inner tributary. Adults land on tree limbs overhanging the dike road, while the immatures, 6 altogether with their uniforms of chocolate brown from head to toe, perch like preschoolers in 1 or 2 adjacent trees. I want to call the class to order, to watch and listen and tell them where they have come from and what it means for them to be here on this day. I want to tell them about their grandparents, those stalwart 7 eagles and the others who followed them, whose resilience and persistence paved the way for their return to the Northeast nearly 50 years ago. I want to stand there, alone with my birds, until they can grasp their own significance. Although my heart is gladdened by the sight of so many bald eagles today, I know that their success and increased numbers haven't been without criticism. Many people don't like having predators in their world, or don't understand that an ecosystem is most healthy when every trophic level is full and balanced. An apex predator like a bald eagle can have enemies among humans who find it hard to watch him take fish from an osprey, or attack its chicks, or take over its platform, or harass loons or herons who are nesting in their lake. Making room for all species is not something we humans do easily. Instead, we pick sides, and often the underdog becomes our cause. We had forgotten that almost 50 years ago, the bald eagle was the underdog, and only with our help and vigilance was saved from extinction. I hope we can learn to champion his comeback, to be tolerant when he behaves according to his true nature, and to ensure the threats that still exist in his world are mitigated so as not to repeat the damage of DDT. And there are significant threats to the eagle we have to be concerned about. Lead poisoning results from lead shot used by hunters that drops into the mud of streams, lakes, and rivers, or is inside the carcasses of waterfowl or deer. Lead fragments are in the gut piles that hunters leave behind to lighten their load when they're leaving the area. It can also come from lead sinkers used in fishing. Lead wreaks havoc on an eagle's nervous and digestive systems, causing him to lose weight and eventually die. Shooting continues to be an issue, as do vehicle deaths. M3 was testament to this. Eagles are scavengers, so a roadkill or carcass on train tracks or on the side of the road are too enticing for a hungry eagle who will arrive to eat dinner and be hit. AVM, or avian vacuolar myelopathy, is caused by a toxin in cyanobacteria, a blue-green algae, that transfers to eagles through water birds like coots. Wind farms, although a positive resource to counter our use of fossil fuels, can also take out eagles, especially when built near their nesting sites. Immatures, as we have learned, are too clumsy and not coordinated enough to avoid the giant blades when learning to fly. Other threats like rodenticides, especially anticoagulant rodenticides, used by homeowners, businesses, and farmers, are lethal to eagles who ingest the targeted rodents, unwittingly looking for an easy meal. The more insidious threats of habitat loss, which often reduces nest sites by logging or thinning of trees or developing lake shores and rivers, and of course climate change, which affects the food supply the eagles depend on. And our latest and perhaps most serious worry, avian flu, which has taken its toll on many eagles, especially in coastal states like Georgia and Florida, but also in former eagle strongholds like Michigan and Minnesota. It is believed that this virus killed 600 eagles in the last few years. Migrating flocks of snow geese usually winter along the Atlantic coast, from New Jersey to South Carolina. On their way south from their breeding grounds in Greenland and Canada, they follow the Atlantic Flyway down the Connecticut River Valley, where they can be seen in New Hampshire, along the Hudson River in New York, and then through New Jersey and Pennsylvania on their way south. Last winter, thousands of these geese succumbed to the avian flu virus in eastern Pennsylvania, and over 1,000 were found dead in New York. Alarmingly, snow geese are a favorite prey item of bald eagles. Avian flu was discovered in 35 counties in Florida in 2024. In 2025, the 2 eaglets who were being viewed by the public on the Southwest Eagle Cam near Fort Myers were found dead due to this virus. Apparently, they had been eating an infected water bird provided by their parents, unwittingly, obviously. The bird is too majestic to be ignored again, but as we have seen with many less charismatic birds, we take our eye off the ball, we lose the brilliant biodiversity we need to make our planet survive. The Bald Eagle Project was a success. Its recovery extraordinary, and the lessons we have learned should be enduring. But as we celebrate the 250th anniversary of our nation, we owe a debt to the natural world around us. We need to respect it, conserve it, and be mindful of its future. I hope you can read Return to the Sky, if you haven't already done so, but most important, that you're able to enjoy the many bald eagles who have made Florida their home. Their comeback in this state has been miraculous, and every sighting of an eagle flying overhead, holding a fish, or carrying it to a nearby nest should be celebrated. Thank you all for listening and for coming out here this morning to hear their story.